Okay, it looks like we are live. It looks like we are back. Welcome to Get Your News On with Ron, everybody. A special edition. We have a guest who I am very, very excited about. I'm a big fan of this guy's music. I've been listening to him for years. And, David, I got to share with you, you have a song about how you don't get played on the radio. And, of course, you were referring to mainstream radio. But I noticed in the comment section on YouTube, there were a bunch of folks who were saying, hey, I play you on my radio show.
Yeah.
And I could have very easily been one of those people. I'm talking to folk singer-songwriter David Rovics, who I've been a fan of for many years. And I used to play your song, Burn It Down, to end my morning show. I had a small lefty morning show in Nashville, Tennessee. It stayed small, unfortunately. That's why it's no longer with us. But I had a small lefty morning show on a non-commercial radio station, and I would close with your song almost every day. It was one of our fun ways to close out the show. So I could have been one of those commenters, too, saying, hey, I played you on the radio. We didn't have any Clear Channel money or pretty much no money whatsoever, but I played you.
Yeah, great. After getting those comments, then I felt a little guilty for having written the song. Like I don't want to diss all the community radio people in case they think I'm talking about them. But
no, I think everyone knew. I think everyone got the theme. Yeah, I don't think the theme was lost on folks. But so you are a singer-songwriter. You've been doing. How long have you been touring at this point? I know you've been doing the work for a long time, man.
I started touring around the country and basically in the U.S. around '97, and then. But before that, I was making a living mainly playing music in the subways in Boston and other places for several years. So I kind of been doing music since sort of full time since probably around '95 or so.
And you were a busker then?
Yeah, I was a busker for several years. Yeah, really.
So what was your material like when you were, because your music is very historical and political. It has a point of view, very funny at times, very confrontational, very brilliant lyrics. Were you doing that type of work when you were a busker too, or was it a little more easy for the passerby? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, if I had any clue about trying, I mean, if I had actually been trying to pay the rent a little better, I mean, I was actually paying the rent from it. So, but I was really just trying to get a lot of practice. I really knew that I wanted to be really good at this and that to be really good at it, you had to work at it a lot. My parents are both musicians, so I didn't, I don't have any illusions about this being easy. So I was really trying to get just a heck of a lot of practice in an environment that was not ideal in a lot of ways to do that in. But definitely the people that make money busking are the ones doing familiar material or the ones who are doing really, really exotic stuff of one kind or another, whether they're naked or riding a unicycle and playing 3 instruments at the same time, or something really impressive, not just another guy with a guitar. But I was doing not my own materials for the most part, but I was doing a lot of obscure labor songs and songs by songwriters nobody's ever heard of. So, every once in a while, some random person would be around who actually recognized something I was doing, but that was very unusual.
But you would do like a Union hymn or something, and they would know it and appreciate it.
It would be, yeah. It would be a lefty generally, I mean, I was doing a lot of like Utah Phillips and Phil Oakes and, stuff that has an audience, but it's a very niche audience,
So I got this thing in the mail, sent to my P.O. box. Somebody sent me a card of some of the old Wobbles hymns. And it looks like it's, and here's the thing, they sent it to me completely anonymously. No return address, no note, just this. It was in like a little envelope. So they were very careful with it, because it looks like, I mean, I don't know how old it is. I've preserved it and stuff. And when I played Boston in June, I meant to say on stage, hey, by the way, if you're here, please introduce yourself.
So it was postmarked from Boston.
It was postmarked from Boston. That's all I know. And I don't know who sent it to me. They did. I've announced it on the show before. I'm like, hey, please get in touch so I can say thank you. And I meant to say something on stage in Boston, and I forgot. Like, I just straight up forgot. So I don't know if the person was in the audience and still just didn't. I don't know, but I was hoping that I could connect with them. So you identify as an anarchist, correct?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, and well, and of course, when we say anarchist, you mean the real thing, not the cartoony type thing that you're taught in school or the cartoony type thing that you hear about the world at large. You actually have a song kind of poking fun at those extremities called "I'm a Better Anarchist Than You," which is a great song, one of my favorites by you. So I want to kind of dive into what all that means to you, because some of my anarchist friends tell me, Ron, you're more of an anarchist than you realize. I personally don't really subscribe to any one-ist per se. I kind of feel like there's a couple from some of them that I like. And I guess if I had to pick one, like if somebody was like, pick one, I guess I would be considered a market socialist. But again, like there's other things I have that are sort of, outside that too. But my anarchist friend tells me you're more of an anarchist because one of the things that I'm big on is kind of community involvement, getting involved in your backyard, taking pride in that backyard, not in a NIMBY sense, but in a sense that this is where change really sprouts. Community gardening, municipal broadband is a big issue for me. I want all cities to own their own internet, to have net neutrality written in the charter. And private property, not a fan, don't think it should be a thing. So my friend tells me those are anarchist views that you hold. Is he correct? Is that true about me?
Well, I mean that there's so many varieties of anarchism, just as there are so many varieties of socialism, communism, social democratic. I mean, it's just that's why so many people who would be described accurately, perhaps as anarchists or socialists or any number of other things, prefer not to use these kinds of alarm bell words, because they're alarm bell words, and nobody, if nobody has a consistent definition of the word, if everybody has different ideas for what they mean, then they become not very useful, or a lot less useful, although we still need these words to describe things, because that's what words do, regardless of how, badly they've been used. So often putting two words together can be a little more helpful, to sort of put yourself, in an ideological sort of place, because like words like you use the term market socialism, so that tells us something about what kind of socialist you're talking about. You're not talking about central economic planning,
right?
So it's and of course what people do with these two words, whether they, that can vary. But I often use the term Noam Chomsky uses, which is a libertarian socialist, which is just another way to describe, a certain form of anarchism. But it's, of course, the question of what does it mean to be any of these things when you're living in the context of, what we might call late stage capitalism, or monopoly capitalist framework, or the whatever we call the situation here in the United States. It's whatever you think should happen in a society that the people have some control over in the future, may or may not be relevant to the situation now, because we're so far from achieving anything close to the most mild form of social democracy that Europe has ever achieved. We've never gotten even close to that.
Yeah, well, and you also have to really kind of embellish on those terms too. Like when I make the statement, I'm not really for private property. When I say that, I don't mean that this isn't my shirt, or this isn't David. What I mean by that is that ownership of land and property, I don't think that's the way we should go. Now, granted, I understand the situation I was born into. I understand the world I was born into. I don't go up to people who are purchasing their homes and going, "You're part of the problem," because I understand that's not the case.
No.
What I'm saying is, if I was designing something from scratch, I wouldn't have private property. We would all be renters. We would all have rights as renters. We would all pay into the system for a certain amount of time, and then it would diminish, and we would just be responsible, for upkeep fees or something like that after you've been a renter for so many years. And housing would be designated a human right. And if anybody doesn't have it, we all have to, figure that out immediately.
Yeah, and
that's
this
how
is how
housing would
it.
work.
Yeah, and this, I mean, whether you abolish private property or not, you can still do housing like that, which is basically if you're getting government housing in Austria or the Netherlands or Germany or Denmark, it's very much like what you've just described in terms of how people get in on it, and they're not renting; they're co-owning. But in many cases, but it's perhaps a matter of semantics. But
Sure, sure.
it can be. I mean, when we're talking about the co-owning thing, it gives more like in the context of a society that's basically a capitalist society where the government can change and it's democracy. And I mean, then if you're co-owning some kind of a co-housing place or some kind of a community that you're part of, then the benefit there is that, at least in theory, when another government comes to power, they can't just say, oh, okay, now we're going to do something completely different with all our public housing, because it's public housing that the public actually is part of owning, and which is different from selling off the public housing like they did in Thatcher's England. But it's a different whole different model where you're not allowed to sell it off. If you're going to move, you can only get back a certain amount from what you put in. And I can't remember exactly how it works, but it's set up so that you can't do what so many people do here, and just like, buy a house in a place where the housing values are going to rise and then sell it and then move, and all this kind of these kind of shell games.
So there's a lot of
Invest in.
protections.
Yeah, there's protections, and also
Mhm.
there's laws that prevent. On the other hand, I know there's these protections, but then there's laws that prevent people from being able to do the kind of real estate speculation that is a normal, mainstay of the American economy. Like they can't, like in countries like Denmark, you cannot own more than one house of the, like when we're talking about houses that have electricity and running water that you can live in all year round, you're only allowed to own one of those. You are allowed to own summer houses and stuff, like places like that. You can have a cabin in the woods somewhere. There's a lot of ways to, exceptions. It's not like a rigid kind of thing for most people. But basically, yeah, you can't own a house that you live in, then own another house that you rent out to a family at a profit. That's not allowed.
Mhm.
That's why when you go to countries like Denmark or Austria or Germany, it's very obvious that these are far, far more prosperous societies, far less stressed societies than ours. But it's also, if you know anybody there, then you also realize that people are living in places that are generally comparable to the kinds of places we have in cities in the U.S. Like, they're generally much better built places, but than like the place I live in here in Portland. But the amount of space is similar, and the cost of rent for similar kinds of places and similar kinds of cities is about half what I pay here.
But David, you live in Oregon and I live in California. We live in the progressive utopias.
Yeah, right.
You're well, so
And
you
these days, what do people, people use these terms to talk about the West Coast as progressive places, but what the term progressive today in the United States is completely it's completely decoupled from any notion of the working class, or that progressivism is the idea of achieving a less divided society by class. Like, I mean, it
it's
seems
been
to all
hijacked.
about. It's been hijacked. It's been
Yeah.
hijacked by people who think it's about any number of other things than the basic stratified nature of our capitalist class divided society.
Well, you have a great song called "If Hillary's a Progressive" that you wrote for the 2016 election, and I am still hoping you do an update on that for our current election. I think
I'll
there's a
have
lot.
to.
There's a lot of. The only thing is you can't write just one. You're gonna have to write one. I mean, you can write one for Kamala. You can write one for Buttigieg. You can write one for all of them.
I'll
So,
probably wait a little while
well, I'm
until
looking
the
forward
field
to it.
narrows.
Well, so when you've been pretty much all over the world with your music, and you've already kind of hinted at this, but if you had to pick one place where you were like, this is how society should run themselves, what place would you pick?
I don't I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there's no place that I've been to that I would like, say it has really got it all figured out. But
Well, of
there's
course.
definitely in so many different ways. I mean, I think we'd have to pick different aspects, but I'd say that the closest place to a sane society that I have been to, that I spend much time in, I would have to be Denmark. I mean,
Then,
there's lots of downsides to the sort of Northern European character, and there's a lot of issues, I think, with depression, alcoholism, and social isolation in Northern Europe. And so I don't want to overstate the case in terms of how, but in terms of but in terms of a lot of things, they've got a lot of stuff figured out. Like in terms of housing policies, I mean, of course, the problem is also we're talking about places that are actually moving in the wrong direction right now. So most people, if you talk to most radicals in Denmark, they're going to be full of complaints about how things are going. But it's just compared to the United States and compared to much of the rest of the world, like the way they do things in terms of housing, in terms of transportation infrastructure, is much better in Denmark than in most of the rest of the world. And it's also true of many other societies in Europe. But Denmark has a lot of that well figured out, and how society structures things in terms of transportation and housing and what the town looks like, urban planning. It defines so much of your experience in life, and people have no idea how much their life experience is defined by these things. But if you've ever lived in an American suburb, or anywhere in Los Angeles, and you've ever lived in Europe, then you know how different these things are from the time you wake up in the morning to the time you go to bed. How much time do we spend in this country, pretty much almost anywhere, in cars by ourselves, stuck in traffic? This is something that actually in many countries in Europe, most people never do. Never.
mm, yeah,
They don't have a car.
right.
And they don't need one. They don't want one.
So there's this show on it's actually been around a long time, and it involves Little Steven from the E Street Band. I don't know if you're a big Springsteen guy, but I'm a big Springsteen guy. And
Mm-hmm.
it's called Lilyhammer. And the premise of it is he's a mob guy. That's kind of, as an actor, that's sort of what he does. You probably saw him in The Sopranos. But he enters witness protection, and he goes to Lilyhammer in Norway.
Right.
And
I love it.
it's such a fun thing because, the whole thing is he's this mob guy and he's having to adapt to this society. But then when you like kind of really take a look at it and you realize, you're like, that's so amazing that they do that. When you move to this place and you're a new person there, and instead of being like, skeptical or like, what's this person doing? You get involved in a community class to help you get a job. They assess what your skills are to find something that's going to be great for you. And these people are invested in their community, and then they help make sure it's safe, and they help make sure there's a good quality of life. And it's like all these things that's unheard of in the majority of communities in the United States. Like, just unheard of something like that existing.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah.
at least to that extent. I shouldn't say
That's
not at
true.
all, but to that extent, to
If
be
it
fair.
exists in the United States, I mean, it does exist in the United States all over the place, but it's informal. It's an informal network, and
Right.
there are many towns, of course, that are really intact, where there is this kind, like where I grew up, where my mother lives. I mean, she just moved, but where she lived for much of her life. And there's this. There were these informal networks. If somebody moved in, they're going to meet their neighbors. But the difference is in Scandinavia, and there are pros and cons to this, but the difference is that there it is institutionalized, and it mostly there's cons, and mostly pros. I'd say mostly it's just a really good thing, and also completely unfamiliar from the American perspective. Just
Right.
so bizarre. And also Americans just don't understand the orientation in places like Scandinavia, where people pay most of their income in taxes and don't feel bad about it. This concept is just so alien to Americans, because we're just so used to the idea that the government is just out there to rip us off and build nuclear missiles. Whereas in Scandinavia, it's just assumed that you're paying taxes for really good government services that are being performed by your relatives and friends and people who work for the government, because half the people do. And they do things like social work and teaching and taking care of small children and the elderly, and It's that's these kinds of jobs are so common
And it's
in
included. They
Scandinavia.
say that it's included. They're like, no, my healthcare
Yeah,
isn't free. It's included.
it's
It's
included. It's just part
included.
of the package.
I
That's
paid
right.
for it. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all paying into it, and we're all getting out from it, and it's from each according to their means to it, or from their, whatever that phrase is, from each from your means to your abilities, or whatever it is. Nobody pays more than they can, and everybody gets all they need.
So there's a huge historical component to what you do, and the songs you sing and the stories you tell. You reference a lot of moments in history. You reference a lot of marginalized moments in history that we don't hear about often, that we're not taught in school. So I have a couple questions. The second part is going to be for book recommendations, but the first is you started doing a program in high schools to try to get these messages out. First of all, how'd you pull that off? Second of all, how was it received?
Oh, it was that was I mean, the hardest part was getting the gigs. I mean, even just getting them for free, is really hard. I mean, forget about getting paid to play in American high schools, but just getting in the door, it was so hard. And I'd say, I can't even remember. It's been a long time, but I don't think I did more than 15 of these kind of gigs, but every time it was a profound experience for some of these kids, clearly. Like every time with giving, which was, to me, just says so much about the power of truth versus lies in terms of what people are exposed to, and if they get exposed to a little bit of reality, what an impact that can have in so many cases where they have just not been exposed to it before. Like, how can you join the military, for example, without knowing what uh, depleted uranium is and does to you? Like, how can you not know what Gulf War syndrome is and multiple chemical sensitivity? How can you not know this, right? You have to know this if you're going
They
to
don't
join the
even tell
military.
kids what PTSD is. They don't
Yeah,
even
that
tell
too,
them that.
right? Yeah, that's right. So I do a set of songs that address questions around PTSD and depleted uranium, and basically reality in the military,
And the
and also
administration had to have been
imperialism.
thrilled.
I mean,
The principal was thrilled. They're like, he's doing the depleted uranium chunk. I love this guy.
yeah,
He's gonna.
these are.
He's
I
doing my
mean,
bachelor party.
even in schools that were run by progressive administrations with teachers that had been working for decades, the administrations and the teachers would get into problems because there was always at least one parent that had issues with what I was talking about. And basically every time somebody got into trouble who was not expecting to get into trouble, and I mean, I eventually started feeling bad about trying to get a gig in high school because I was going to get somebody into trouble, even if they thought they weren't going to get into trouble. And I also had a gig where I was touring with Attila the Stockbroker,
I love
a
Attila.
songwriter, a
I
wonderful
love that
poet.
guy. I love that guy.
Well, he unexpectedly started promoting beer in front of 400 high school students in Chicago, and in the suburbs of Chicago,
Because they
actually.
get where he lives, they can drink it at that age.
They
It's
can, and
not a
it's
big
totally
deal.
normal and socially acceptable. And like the teachers at the school in Chicago were fully prepared for my anti-imperialist rant. I mean, the Gulf War was underway. Not the Gulf War, the Iraq War in 2003 was underway, and it was a very hot topic. And of course, most people were only being exposed to basically pro-war propaganda, and they were prepared that here was going to come a guy to the school who does not support the war, and they're okay with that, and that's understood. But they were not prepared for Attila to promote beer drinking. So even at that gig, where I probably would not have had a problem for what I was actually doing there, that ended up being one of the worst problems.
What did Attila say?
I mean,
He's
he
just like,
just
in England, that's just normal. What's the problem?
I mean, it was just like he knew. I don't know how much he was performing for high school students. He had done some perform, but I think it was just like he had it in his head. Okay, I'm playing for high school students. High school students drink beer. This is how we're going to connect, and that maybe is a good assumption in England, but and still problematic for some groups, I'm sure, in England too. But it's a matter of like whether it's socially acceptable generally, and it is there. Certainly it was, and probably still is, That's not that may have used to be at some point. That was probably the case in the U.S. I'm pretty sure it would have been okay to give that rant in the 70s, maybe, but I don't think now it's not. No.
So what are some book recommendations you have for some good history lessons, some good anarchist writers, just anything you want to throw out there that people really need to grab from their library as soon as they can?
Well, if you're from the United States and you want to know the history of this country, you definitely got to read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. There's a lot of other books that are fantastic, and I could recommend lots of them. But in terms of like an overview, in terms of big overview, that's an amazing book. In terms of a big overview of sort of the history of much of the world, especially the parts that Europe and the United States have been very involved with, I highly recommend Robert Fisk's book. What is it called? His big work, and it was can't remember the title. But if you look at Robert Fisk, a journalist from England who writes for The Independent, and it's like his big 800-page book of the history of basically his career and tied in with the past century. And yeah, that's a fantastic book. What have I read lately? Evicted, in terms of the situation with housing and class in the United States today. Evicted is definitely one of the best contemporary books.
I'm writing all these down.
Good.
Right now I'm reading the history of the United States in 10 strikes. It's a really cool read.
Oh, great.
It's a fun one. It's a fun one. Yeah. Well, maybe fun's a weird way to put it, but it's a very informative book, and I'm getting a lot out of it. All right, so let's bring this to your music now. You have not one, but two podcasts that you got going on right now. This week with David Rovics, I'm familiar with. You kind of usually you tell a story or give a certain kind of like auditory essay, and it's connected with the song you're about to play. I remember, there was one where you told a story about how you were in Santa Cruz and were not treated very kindly. And I've listened to a lot of those. Some of them you talked about your experiences in the high school. And then you have a new podcast now. So give folks the skinny about both of those projects.
Yeah, that one, This Week with David Rovics, I'll keep on doing on a occasional basis when I got something to say. And then the Song for Today podcast is more of a regular thing where for this date in history, songs that are related to something that happened on this date in history, usually things that are particularly relevant for the current political scene, and that's with a bit more explanation than I was doing the podcast before with less explanation. Now it's still short, but there's more explanation, more context about what the songs are about, and then there's a song, and the songs are from studio albums generally.
Where can people go to find all your stuff? I know you're touring, you got a new album coming out. Where can people go to get these podcasts, to get everything? Where's the hub?
Everything, davidrovics.com.
Perfect.
And they can get onto all the different platforms from there.
Awesome. So davidrovics.com. Everybody check it out. David, been a fan of yours for years now. Finally got to see you live recently. I know right now your touring doesn't have the Los Angeles area in the cards, but I hope you'll be back very soon. Come to Los Angeles proper too, man. You did somewhere out in where was it? It was out
Topanga.
in Topanga. Yeah, that was a cool spot. Oh, I loved it too. But yeah, LA. Come to LA proper.
Love to come to LA. Yeah, someday again. I think the last time was a really great gig, but I only had 2 songs at the Troubadour with Tom Morello for Joe Hill's the 100th anniversary of his execution. So I don't know. I have to wait for some other big anniversary.
Sounds like a pretty good gig. Yeah, that sounds like a good gig.
Great. It was really good.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. DavidRovics.com, everybody. Check it out. And David, I hope you'll join us again, especially as election season heats up. I always love hearing from you. And love your music.
Let's talk about it.
You've been the song of the day many times on my show. I've mentioned some of your songs. And so everybody, David Rovics, finally got him on the show. Check it out, davidrovics.com, for everything he's up to. And David, I look forward to having you back again soon. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks so much, Ron.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.